Hello, this is the second in a series of talk-throughs of sections of the book Absolutization, which is the first volume of my middle way philosophy series, the one that lays down an account of the problem that we need to respond to, the problem of getting stuck, of thinking that we have the whole story. In the first section of the book, which was titled Early Buddhism, there was a discussion of the phenomena of proliferation, whereby we continue to have the same thoughts over and over again, we get stuck. There was discussion of craving and hatred and delusion, which you also find in Buddhist discussion, the absoluteness of negations, and the phenomenon of excluding the options, both of which really lay the foundation for understanding the middle way as the alternative to absolutization. Absolutization occurs on two sides. Now, this second section, which I'm going to concentrate on now, is headed Systems Theory. So obviously we're moving on primarily from a focus on Buddhism and what Buddhism has to contribute to the understanding of absolutization, to systems theory and what that has to contribute. But as always, there'll be bits of other things, there'll be relationships drawn between different traditions and ways of thinking, because this is a synthetic approach. Okay, so this section of the book has 3 chapters, and those 3 chapters focus on 3 different aspects of the way that systems theory can help us to understand absolutization. So the first is about reinforcing feedback loops. The second is about the independence of an assumed system independence in the case of cognition. And the third one is about fragility. So all of those are features that are commonly discussed or assumed in systems theory, but which are of particular relevance to middle way philosophy. So I'm going to start with reinforcing feedback loops. So these are incredibly central, I think, to middle way philosophy, to understand reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops, and varying vocabulary is used to discuss these in different contexts. So quite often, confusingly, they're referred to as positive and negative feedback loops, and the positive ones are negative and the negative ones are positive. So the by which I mean that what are referred to as positive feedback loops, recurring, closed, reinforcing feedback loops, are the ones that generally have a negative effect on us, and the so-called negative ones, the open or balancing feedback loops, are the ones that we generally need that have a positive effect on us. So it's important not to get confused by the terminology to start with, and to take into account the different ways it may be used in different contexts. So I use the terms reinforcing and balancing to try and avoid that confusion, and particularly I think the inspiration for this comes from Donnell Meadows. So Donnell Meadows' introductory book on systems, which I highly recommend, is the best place to start reading with systems. She uses those terms, and she does so in a way that helps to avoid that confusion. Okay, so reinforcing feedback loops are the repetition of the same kind of process over and over again. So you can find these loops in organic processes even. So the revolution of planets around the sun, for example. You can also find it in the behaviour of organisms and indeed in the beliefs of human beings. So we can track these kinds of feedback loops all the way through a spectrum from the most basic starting conditions through to complex human processes. When we're talking about organisms, reinforcing feedback loops are basically what organisms use to maintain themselves. So organisms want to carry on doing the same things in order to continue as organisms, and so in some ways they're out of balance. Us living is pushing at the conditions all the time in a certain way. So we want to carry on living. We want to reproduce ourselves, generally speaking, as organisms. So to do that, we've got to carry on doing the same sorts of things. We've got to carry on eating, meeting our needs in other ways. And we tend to do the same things, which are necessary to continually produce the things we need. Animals, be they ever so relatively simple, or even plants, other organisms, continue to find food and consume that food, which is very repetitious behaviour. For instance, and they have other kinds of repetitious behaviour, like reproductive behaviour, which replicate themselves or replicate some features of themselves or enable themselves to continue in more or less in their current form. Now, reinforcing feedback loops, even at the basic, simple level of organisms, are also, they're balanced with balancing feedback loops. So organisms also have to respond to their environment. They have to keep adapting. So balancing feedback loops are what happens whenever a new input, new information changes the way an organism behaves, or possibly the way it's internally organised, which creates the possibility of further changes in the future. Obviously, the level of simple organisms, you don't have to worry about the morality of reinforcing or balancing feedback loops. They'll get on with what they're doing. But when it comes to humans, those two processes have become more complex, and what's most basically made them more complex is imagination. So our ability to represent to ourselves different possible scenarios using different possible internal organisations, so different possible connections in our brains and nervous system primarily, which enable us to reflect on different possibilities and then act in different ways, perhaps, because of that reflection. So the fact that we can think and imagine shifts everything. Not only does it make us more flexible, so in some ways it makes balancing feedback loops easier, because we can respond in different, in a wider range of different possible ways. It also enables us to get stuck in new ways. So this is where meaning and belief, and the distinction between meaning and belief, become important. And so belief can take the form of reinforcing feedback loops, which is where we get absolutization. So if we continue with the same beliefs, the same, which may result in the same kinds of behaviour, but it's the same basic judgments which create that behaviour. So it's the judgments that are the key basic thing. If we continue doing the same thing over and over again, but the conditions change, then we become maladapted to those new conditions. We carry on behaving in the same way in the context of a relationship. For example, so our partner changes, as they grow older, or they develop new interests or new insights, but we carry on treating them the same way, and the relationship deteriorates. That's a simple and common example, but there are all sorts of ways in which are continuing to hammer away at the same responses. Those responses may have been fine to start with, but as we carry on and things change, then they become ill-adapted responses. And that's the problem with reinforcing feedback loops for us. They become absolutized beliefs. And they're related to mental proliferation, which I talked about in the first section of the book. Okay, so absolutized beliefs, reinforcing feedback loops, and another interesting feature of reinforcing feedback loops, which I also discuss in this chapter, is escalation. So reinforcing feedback loops can get into conflict with each other. So different systems compete with each other within the same wider system, and in the process disrupt the wider system. So Donnell Meadows, for example, gives the example of people in a party who talk louder and louder and louder because everyone else is talking louder and louder and louder. So in order to be heard, you have to keep talking louder. So a competition emerges, and the effects of doing the same thing again and again become more and more exaggerated. So you can chart that process of escalation in the workings of capitalism and exploitation of the planet, for example. So that chapter is basically about the relationships between reinforcing feedback loops, which is a general feature of organisms, and human belief, and the way in which human belief can be absolutized. And as I say, to understand that fully, you also need to take into account the distinction between meaning and belief, and the way in which beliefs can become absolutized, even though meaning, as we use it in our imagination, can be the way of releasing, allowing new conditions to come into play, and us becoming aware of new possibilities, and thus allowing a balancing feedback loop to come in. So that's the first chapter in this section, which is concerned with systems theory. The second one is called assumed system independence. So assumed system independence is it's rarely articulated, it seems, as a formal element of systems theory, but it's pretty much always assumed, and it is articulated by Donnell and Meadows. So assumed systems independence is the idea that systems are always interlinked. In the world that we experience, at least, rather than a completely abstracted one, systems are always connected, often in unpredictable ways, with other systems, and systems are stacked up in incredibly complex hierarchies and interrelationships with each other. From the very, very smallest systems, like atoms, through to the largest ones we can comprehend, like the universe. So within that incredibly complex stacking of interrelated systems, nobody found an independent system. That is, a system which operates completely unaffected by what's going on around it. And there would be difficulties in in understanding such a system if it did exist, because we couldn't interact with it. But anyway, we haven't experienced such a system. And but the incredible thing is that we tend to assume that we are the exceptions to the interdependence of systems. And we assume that in our way of thinking about cognition, so particularly what's generally a philosophical way of assuming that our representations of the world work. So we tend to assume that our cognitive system consists of a set of representations of the world which are independent of that world, and independent particularly of our bodies and the functioning of our bodies which interact with our minds. So obviously the mind-body dichotomy is one such example of that assumed system independence. So yeah, this tendency to assume that we're independent can be closely related to the neuroscience of the hemispheres, and the tendency of the left hemisphere to assume it has the whole story, when at that point anyway where it is over dominant over the right hemisphere, which it often is. So at that point it is repressing the right hemisphere. It seems primarily using the corpus callosum as a repressive instrument. That's not the only thing the corpus callosum does, linking the two hemispheres, but it does seem to be a lot of what it does. So the left hemisphere, which forms these conscious representations of the world, these beliefs that we hold, basically chooses to ignore new input, creating reinforcing feedback loops, and it does that by continuing the assumption that it's independent of things around it, that its truths are the whole story, and these truths continue regardless of new information that may come along to try and disrupt them. So yeah, the left hemisphere is constantly dependent on the right for the meaning that it uses to create its beliefs, and our judgments are constantly dependent on our bodies and are influenced by our bodies, as in the example of people sitting on hard chairs which make harder judgments, for instance. So yeah, the hemispheric neuroscience can give, and also some branches of psychology, cognitive psychology, can give further evidence of the delusion of system independence. But more basically, recognizing that system independence is nonsense depends on looking at the bigger picture, really, and using a systems approach which focuses on relationships rather than idealized objects. Just the whole idea of systems theory as an approach effectively means that we can't treat a system as independent. But sometimes we forget to apply this to ourselves, and we start treating our cognitive system as independent. So given that it can't be, that means that we cannot accept representationalism, which we come onto in the next section of the book. We need to think in an embodied way about meaning, not a disembodied way as has been traditional. And we need to take into account uncertainty at every stage. So we are part of the wider system, which means that we do not have an independent standpoint from which we can be certain of anything in our representations. Okay, so that's the second of the three chapters on systems theory, and then the third one, Fragility, is about the way in which reinforcing feedback loops continue until they certainly don't. So in terms of our beliefs, we maintain a set of coherent beliefs which remain stable as long as they are addressing the circumstances, the conditions well enough for the moment, until the adverse conditions become overwhelming and then they suddenly snap or break. So the change, when they do break, is relatively fast. It's not instantaneous. This is where the principle of incrementality comes in, which is more of a theme of the second book in this series, which has a whole section on incrementality. So things always happen gradually, but they can happen relatively fast as well within that gradual framework. And when things happen relatively fast, that's what's understood in systems theory as a tipping point. So basically one set of conditions fades out and another comes in. We begin to recognize a new set of conditions, and because of the power of that recognition, we quite rapidly switch from one to the other. So the way this manifests itself, the way this fragility manifests itself in changes of belief, is through what I call flips, or dramatic conversions, where we move rapidly. After a lot of pressure, perhaps we move rapidly from one belief to its opposite. St. Paul's conversion in the book of Acts is a well-known example of that. St. Paul has been repressing his degree of sympathy for Christianity. He's been trying to repress Christianity itself by persecuting Christians, and then there's an external event which triggers a change. So there's all this pressure within him. You could say this conflict which has been repressed, but then he falls off his horse, and that seems to trigger a dramatic change in his understanding, and he hears a voice which he interprets as the voice of God, which asks, why has he been persecuting Christians? So he gets new awareness crowding in relatively quickly, and he recognises a new standpoint that he's been repressing. So of course then he flips directly from one position, one absolute position, Christians are evil, let's persecute them, to the opposite position, embrace Christianity, believe everything Christians believe. So that's can also be manifested subsequently in a change of group identity and group allegiance, as it does in religious conversion. But more basically, it's the flip in belief of the individual. So we can get smaller versions of that when we're forced by circumstances into a reassessment of an untenable view of another person, for example, that we've perhaps trusted or distrusted without sufficient justification. Or we can have flips in political belief, or whatever. So again, flips can occur at a relatively simple or relatively complex level, but it's this dramaticness that shows the role of absolutization in the process. That if we held a belief absolutely, then it's liable to go quickly when the conditions become overwhelming. Okay, and in this chapter also I briefly discuss the opposite quality to fragility, which is anti-fragility, as discussed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. So anti-fragility is actually the property of growing stronger in adversity. So Taleb talks about it. We work a muscle by subjecting it to little shocks, and it gradually gets stronger through that exercise. And I think this is important for understanding provisionality, particularly. So the alternative to absolutized beliefs is provisional beliefs, and provisional beliefs can get stronger the more they're exposed to different kinds of conditions. Yeah, so the more we open ourselves to balancing feedback loops, the more we allow our conditions to be, our beliefs to be gradually changed by new conditions. And they actually become stronger. We actually can then justify more confidence, not less, in our beliefs than we would if we had simply hung on to an absolute version of them and flipped from one to the opposite and so on. So yeah, fragility as a feature of absolutization also tells us something about anti-fragility as the alternative, as a feature of the middle way. Okay, so those are the 3 chapters about systems theory. So I'm going to stop there. But yeah, as I've said throughout this series, this is really just a way of helping you to access those chapters of the book. They're not really a substitute for reading them, so do look more closely at the content of the book itself. So that's it for now.